Hello and good afternoon. My name is Hannah Morris. I'm the Assistant Director of Government Affairs at J Street, and I'm excited to welcome you this afternoon for a conversation with Salam Al-Marayati. He is the President of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and he founded the organization in 1998, or co-founded it, and he's been a true ally to J Street over the years. Having spoken at our conferences before. Many of you might know he's appeared on CNN, he's been in our various publications that we all read, and he's an expert on Islam in the West, as well as Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, Middle East politics, and more. And I'm excited to bring him here today and have a conversation about how MPAC is now addressing the COVID-19 crisis. We all know that various vulnerable communities, including the Muslim community, have been adversely affected by the crisis. So we will be discussing what MPAC is doing, how it's seeking to address these inequities, what the advocacy looks like today, and how the organization shifted gears. But before we do that, I want to allow Salam to introduce himself, as well as, if you don't mind, first just sharing a little bit about how your Ramadan went this year in your family, in your community. I know a lot of us in the Jewish communities and Christian communities recently celebrated Passover and Easter respectively in very new situations. So if you could just please share what that was like this year, as well as maybe any silver linings.
Well, first of all, thank you, Hannah, and thank you to J Street for continuing this wonderful partnership that we've had for many years. And we hope and pray to God that the partnership will not only continue for many years to come, but will be demonstrating to the larger society, to the American public, the value of the work that we can do together as Muslim and Jewish organizations who are working in advocacy for the betterment of our society and for serving our communities. And I think what brings us together is exactly that, that issue of what our values are in terms of advocacy. Our values are both in the Jewish and the Muslim faiths. They are about mercy, compassion, and justice. That's what Tikkun Olam is about. That is what Islam, what we call Islah, or reform is about, and renewal, and bringing those values to society to establish equity. And to me, I don't want to be a part of any organization or any religion for that matter that does not have equity as its cornerstone of the faith. That's what the Quran says, and I believe that is what the Torah says as well. So that is what brings us together. And this Ramadan, I have to tell you, I actually enjoyed it more than previous Ramadans. I didn't have to drive 100 miles a night to go to and from iftars. I was able to stay home in solitude and embrace the solace with my wife and my daughter. And we enjoyed the breaking of the fast. And we didn't have to go to restaurants or have the kebabs every night at mosques or community centers or government institutions or law enforcement places where they all wanted to celebrate Ramadan with us, which, you know, as a matter of service, we would have to accept the invitations. And I didn't have to deal with that this year. I was able to have that. Yeah, and the purpose of Ramadan is really to connect with yourself by fasting. And that really enabled us, the solitude enabled us to do that exactly every night in Ramadan, the 30 nights that we practiced the breaking of the fast. And in many ways, this is going back to the prophets. I believe that Prophet Moses and Abraham and Muhammad and all the prophets from Isaac and Jacob and David and Solomon, all the prophets we believe in Islam, the biblical prophets are also Islamic prophets. They practiced the fast in solitude. They would go to places where they would be able to reflect on life and think about and ponder about God's creation and how we can be better stewards of the earth. And with that, I think we embraced the traditions of the prophets this Ramadan.
Well, that's a beautiful way of putting it, and I appreciate that. And I think, as devastating as this crisis has been on the humanitarian level, and so many, there are some of those silver linings of being able to stop and take, be reflective and take notice of where you are in your life. So given that, I would really appreciate, and just I'll stop right here and remind folks that you can submit questions in the Q&A chat box. So feel free to do that, and I will be taking those questions later in the conversation. But going back, I want to ask you really about what MPAC is, its mission, and why did you co-found it? And if you don't mind just sharing a little bit about
Sure.
your
And
organization.
actually, yeah, I think there was a typo in what we sent you. It's 1988 that we founded the organization. So, so in 1988, we felt at that time that there was no Muslim advocacy organization. There was no Muslim public affairs organization. We were busy with dealing with Ramadan and the Friday prayers, and then the community service and the social services and the marriages and the counseling. And so there was no capacity of the mosques to really deal with the larger society, to deal with what really is driving the perceptions of Islam, and that is global events and politics and what we find in Hollywood. So we decided to form an organization at that time. I was working as a public relations official at the Islamic Center of Southern California. And at that time, we had a wonderful relationship with Rabbi Alfred Wolf of Wilshire Boulevard Temple and Monsignor Royal Vatican of the Archdiocese, and we developed an interfaith partnership there. And it's with Rabbi Wolf, Monsignor Vatican, and Dr. Hattout, who's my mentor and the founder of MPAC. Really, those three really developed a wonderful program, and for me as a Muslim, that's a trinity I can accept. So we had the work of these three individuals really mushroom into something larger, and hence we decided to form MPAC that really worked on interfaith cooperation and public policy that affected and impacted Islam and Muslims, because our public officials and our decision makers have been, and to a large extent to this day, are uneducated about Islam and Muslims. They say something, and I'm sure it's true for every community, but when it comes to such proportionality, a great proportion of what they say and what they do impacting lives, literally, whether we can save lives or not, we need to educate them about who we are as Muslims and bring about peace through that kind of collaboration with our decision makers. And then when it came to the media, obviously the stereotypes, and again, this is something that J Street and MPAC both deal with on a daily basis, the stereotypes about our communities that drive the public understanding or public misunderstanding of Islam and Muslims. And we formed a Hollywood Bureau to deal with that piece. So we have a Hollywood Bureau in Los Angeles, and we have a government relations office in Washington, D.C. to deal with the two arms of the organization, and they are public opinion and public policy.
Thanks. And so, as I understand it, historically, the organization, if it's been focusing on the Hollywood view of Muslims, you have the public affairs issues focused, I believe, on counterterrorism, radicalization, issues on foreign policy and immigration. It's got to have been a big shift then this year to decide, with the COVID crisis, we are going to shift to human security as the top priority of the organization. So can you tell us a little bit about what that human security initiative is and how this will be addressing the inequities that Muslim Americans and other vulnerable communities are facing during this crisis?
Sure, and thank you for the question. Well, first of all, after 9/11, we lived in a different world from before 9/11. The world changed on 9/11, and that is why counterterrorism was a major policy shift, even of the United States government. And so we had to shift as a Muslim public policy organization. And then it led to the rise of ISIS and all the problems there. And unfortunately, the root causes of terrorism, specifically from the Middle East, were not improving. They were worsening. And they are the dismantlement of strong central government, the rise of militias, and the inequities of society, the injustices against people that led to war and radicalization and terrorism, refugee crisis, and it became a vicious cycle. And there was a paradigm of the West was at war with Islam, and Islam is at war with the West. Islam versus the West is the lie that keeps on giving us. It keeps on giving us war, radicalization, terrorism, violations of civil liberties. And so we engaged on that policy. So similarly, the rise of the coronavirus meant that now we're living in a different world than from before the coronavirus. And human security is a centerpiece, therefore, of dealing with the coronavirus. In fact, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, a year ago, January of 2019, there's a report where he said, and I believe his name is Daniel Coates, or Coates is his last name. He said, we need to be aware of a rise of a pandemic that will create a global economic shutdown and create more problems for society. So the writing was on the wall that this was going to happen, and we were not ready for it. And it has exposed the flaws in our governance and in our system. And so health security, economic security is fundamental to keeping our society intact. If we don't, it will dismantle, there will be chaos, rioting, and there will not be the same America or that ideal America that we're all striving for. Human security, therefore, is fundamentally an imperative for national security. National security is the security of the state. Human security is the security of the people, of communities. And for American Muslims, we have the largest portion of our community is African American. The African American Muslim community is over a third of the American Muslim community. So they and we are being impacted disproportionately. The number of deaths, the number of essential workers who are in those fields, the number of health deficiencies as a result of lack of health care, that is paramount in terms of human security, therefore. We also have health workers. American Muslims are disproportionately represented in the healthcare force. For example, even though we are 1% of the population, we're 15% of the doctors in Michigan alone. We're 10% of the doctors in New York City. And we also have Muslim small businesses that have been impacted and whom we need in order to recover. So we are addressing those issues as a part of human security. We will not have national security unless human security is addressed and is attained. And then the last thing I want to say about that is that, sorry for the phone, is that we formed the Department of Homeland Security in right after 9/11, we should form an office for human security within the federal government as a response to the coronavirus, the COVID-19 crisis.
Thank you for that breadth. So in terms of what you are advocating for now, I think it would be really helpful for you to, parse that out beyond the, Office for Human Security. I know, for example, that the House recently passed the HEROES bill, which would contain a second round of stimulus checks, hazard pay for essential workers, 6 additional months of COVID-19 unemployment, funding for state and local governments. Obviously, that passed the House. Remains to be seen whether it can get anywhere in the Senate. How does MPAC view that bill? does it effectively address the needs of vulnerable communities that you're looking out for? Um, if it's not adequately addressing these needs, what else would MPAC be advocating for?
The bill is another good step in the right direction, and it's definitely needed. And we were happy to see it pass in the House. Unfortunately, because of partisan politics, it's being stalled in the Senate. And we feel that many of the features of the HEROES Act is exactly what we're advocating for as it relates to human security. The one thing I want to focus on, and we don't have time to go over the whole bill, is that we need to empower community health clinics. They are the ones who are trusted by communities, especially vulnerable communities. Vulnerable communities do not trust the federal government. They do not trust their law enforcement. So how do we then address the issue of testing and tracing and surveillance at a time when there is no trust? Then it has to be through the autonomous, empowering work of local community health clinics. They're the ones that can implement these important measures so that we can go back to living a new normal, but somewhat better than being completely isolated in the past. They're the ones who are trusted by the community. They're the ones who have the experience. And the more we can see that in legislation, then I believe that that is not only an advancement for human security, but it is an advancement of American national interests. And it will help us recover much more smoothly than without that important piece in the legislation.
So to your point about empowering these local clinics, is that about funding? Is it greater public awareness? How would you envision that?
Number one is to have a national plan, which we don't have. And if that needs to come from an amalgamation of local or municipal departments of health service, then so be it. If it needs to come from Washington, so be it. But there needs to be a national plan, or at least a coordination of the regions in a plan. Number two, definitely in terms of funding, as I said, the flaws in the system were there from the beginning, and they're exacerbated by the lack of funding of these community health clinics to date. Number three is the autonomy of these health clinics. And what I mean by that is we should not look at these health clinics as a way of getting more information to data companies and to the federal government and to and definitely not intelligence or law enforcement. It needs to be done for the sake of health security. And this is where human security and health security are critical to our advancement as a society in the recovery. So that autonomy and that wall of separation between social, medical, and human services on the one hand, and the traditional national security measures of either more military or more policing, we have that wall of separation in this bill.
So just as a reminder, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat, and we'll be taking those shortly. But I want to speak specifically to the issue of surveillance. You mentioned making sure that the health information isn't gathered. So where are your primary concerns as it relates to civil liberties and the privacy rights debate that's going on right now? Do you think we should be worried about the tech companies or US states potentially hoarding all of our health information? Or do you actually see reasons to be hopeful that US citizens' privacy will remain paramount? Like, how vigilant do we as citizens need to be right now?
We need to be very vigilant, but in short, we need to find that sweet spot between, not having any information being assessed, processed, and acted upon by those in authority, versus this being another police operation in the making. So other countries that have recovered have used surveillance, and that's basically the surveillance of individuals who are tested and have been traced to being infected by the virus, and determine who where their interaction has been and with whom, and a policy of isolation implemented as a result. So we believe that the health officials are the ones that should make that determination, and that wall of separation in principle should be there. To what extent they need to be sharing that information with the government, I think we need to be hearing from these health officials. I mean, they are the government with law enforcement and the federal government in terms of the Department of Justice or the Department of Homeland Security, or even the FBI and the CIA. I don't feel there's a need to do that. So we need to be very strict in terms of preserving civil liberties in the process. And again, even after 9/11, we started quoting Benjamin Franklin, who said, those who are, and I'm paraphrasing, those who are willing to give up civil liberties for the sake of security deserve neither. And if we are going to give up our civil liberties now for health security, we're going to get neither. So we need to find that sweet spot and listen to the experts, and probably have more of a national conversation on this, because I haven't heard any. I don't know if you have, Hannah, but I haven't really. I've heard about a plan that is ready to come out and be to unfold, and we got all the testing, we're doing all this, but what's happening to the information after that? I don't think the American public understands it, and that means to me that we don't have a real plan.
Yeah, I agree. It sounds like Apple and Google have come together for some sort of tracing plan, but the effects of how we're bought into that, what our rights are with that information once it's collected is very unclear. And that is concerning. And I don't know if there is yet a good model country, like in terms of other countries that you have seen that have done this well, where they are collecting the data but maintaining the rights of citizens. I think a lot of other countries are much more comfortable with the government collecting that data. Have you seen anything?
I don't know. That's a good question, actually. We should look at that. But as you alluded, I think other countries don't have the complexity of society that the United States has.
Right.
And so this is not going to be, definitely not a one-size-fits-all model. And definitely we need to be looking at other states that remain open as a society as opposed to authoritarian, and how they do it. And so, whether we look at Italy or France or other countries or Germany, I think the number one thing that they did is they started the testing right away. And I feel like we're still lagging behind on the testing, but we should definitely look into those examples.
Right. And I have a question here from Roberta Colton, who's asking specifically about, are there steps, maybe this is broader than COVID specifically, that, and maybe this is a post-Trump administration kind of conversation, but are there steps that could be taken to increase the trust of both the Muslim community and other vulnerable communities when it comes to federal government and law enforcement? Obviously, this has not been a good week when it comes to law enforcement and vulnerable communities. What would you say to that if we are having this conversation in the context of civil liberties?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The Quran says, and I believe it's also in other scriptures, that every time people start fanning the flames of violence and war, God extinguishes that fire. And so first of all, we should look to God as that the means of achieving peace and reconciliation, and put our trust in God. And that doesn't mean we don't do the work. We do the work and then put our trust in God. Number two, we need to work with allies. And there are allies within law enforcement. There are allies within the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. And we have to remember the FBI has two divisions, mainly, the National Security Division and the Civil Rights Division. The Civil Rights Division is in charge of investigating hate crimes and violations of civil rights. And so on this issue, and I worked on a faith-based advisory council for the Department of Homeland Security last year, where we published a report on white supremacist violence that was targeting synagogues, mosques, churches, and temples. Number one, we have to look at this problem as not just an internal domestic problem. It has become a transnational problem. So when somebody invokes what happened in New Zealand and then goes and attacks the synagogue in Poway near San Diego, that is a transnational problem. When somebody starts quoting from the manifesto of, I forgot the name of the guy, but he's the one who killed
The Norway man?
From Norway, and starts doing something similar here. That's a transnational problem. The double standard of looking at Muslim-related violence and then others as, well, one is international, they're attacking us, as opposed, and then the other, well, they're part of us, so we'll handle it as family. That double standard is obliterated right now by fact. So we need to do that kind of education, not just with law enforcement, but within the American public, because as soon as you bring up a Muslim issue, which is usually a Muslim stereotype, then the bells start ringing and the flags start going up, and everybody, it becomes a national crisis. But if it's a white supremacist who does something, well, he's one of our guys, Dylan Roof, okay, he's just a bad apple, and so on and so forth. So we have to remove the double standard. The third thing then we need to do is use best practices. I believe we have a good practice here in Los Angeles. There may be some best practices in Washington or New York or Chicago. We need to raise the voices of those groups that have demonstrated best practices and bring those voices. So if the LA police chief, for example, is going to issue a statement about what happened in Minneapolis against Mr. Floyd and the barbaric act of suffocating that man to death, that's a voice we need to raise as a community. And the mayor of LA, and so we can work each in our locality, but raise these voices to create a national voice, because right now there's a deadly silence about every incident that has happened in the modern era as it relates to the killing of African American men at the hands of law enforcement, and that whole the prison pipeline, where more and more people are thrown into are incarcerated simply because of their backgrounds, because they fit a profile, or there's a certain way of looking at them as opposed to the larger society where they become incarcerated. We're the most incarcerated country in the world right now in terms of percentage. So the most incarcerations that is in the world. So we have to deal with that reality and address all these points.
So to that end, what is MPAC doing to ensure that U.S. lawmakers and the public remain engaged on the issues that have been at the core of MPAC's work for the last decade or two? We've just gotten a bit into the discussion about what problems still remain. Can you tell us about how that advocacy work continues, maybe some other wins you've had, and how you're engaging, I think, a little bit more on the civil liberties side, because I think that will be a huge, huge issue in the coming years.
Yeah, I think there was a bill that was part of a renewal of a Patriot Act clause, where again, House Democrats made a compromise, but then it was killed later on. But these kinds of surveillance issues are important for us to address. The one thing I want to share with your audience, Hannah, is when we look at civil liberties against Muslims, it's not a Muslim issue. Islamophobia is not a Muslim issue, just like anti-Semitism is not a Jewish issue. They're both American issues. When we see the rise of anti-Muslim bigotry, it is the canary in the coal mine. It is telling us that there's a problem in the larger society. And when it goes unchecked, then everybody is going to suffer. So when we talk about the Muslim ban, it's not just Muslims. It's Persian Jews and Iraqi Christians and so many other people of other faiths who suffer from that, or Syrian Christians for that matter. So we have to rethink the way we look at the rest of the world and the way we look at Islam. For too long, it has been the bogeyman that has allowed people to be uncreative, both in Hollywood and in Washington, and give us this simplistic paradigm of the world as us versus them, as this group now being the threat to civilization. There is no threat to civilization. The only threat to civilization is our own means of deteriorating the values of our society. And that is the real threat to our civilization. And I think the other issue, let's face it, a lot of it does come from international relations. And so, again, we appreciate the efforts of J Street in opposing the annexation of the West Bank. These are issues that are not just foreign issues. They have an impact on all of us as Americans. We pay our tax dollars that goes towards, that is going in part towards annexation. We have the military who is on guard, and we're putting young American men and women in harm's way. We're losing Israeli lives and Palestinian lives all the time. So we have to come to grips with the reality that what happens in international arena has an impact on us as Americans, and that also has an impact on civil liberties for American Muslims and for all Americans.
So, as a final question, and I think we'll wrap up, what would you ask American Jews to do in support of the Muslim community in this time of coronavirus? I mean, I believe everyone has to come together and look out for each other, but anything specific that the American Jewish community can do in that context, and again, more broadly to your point about all the other things going on in the world?
Well, I think MPAC and J Street can lead a conversation on that in terms of what Muslims and Jews can do together. And I thank you for the opportunity to illustrate that in our webinar today, as just a small sample of what we could do together. And number two, there are several Muslim-Jewish partnerships throughout the country. And it's interesting that the more we get into interfaith work, the more we realize that it's the Muslim and Jewish communities that are the closest, really, when it comes to our values and the way we look at monotheism and the way we deal with Christmas, because we're both minorities and have to deal with telling our children, we don't celebrate Christmas necessarily, but we can share in the celebration without actually practicing it or changing our religion to do so. So we have a lot in common. And I wish we could take all these local efforts and connect the dots and create that national conversation, because another stereotype is that Muslims and Jews have been fighting each other for forever. And that's a very Eurocentric idea. What I mean by that, for example, is that when Europe was going through the Dark Ages, Muslims and Jews were celebrating the Golden Age in Spain. So why isn't that part of our curriculum? Why isn't that part of our upbringing? When you nurse a baby on toxicity, that baby will become irreparably damaged. And the same thing is happening to America. We keep nursing our future generation on this idea that we're violent and we're always going to be at war, and yes, it's the Jews this and it's the Muslims that. So how can we dismantle or deconstruct that to have a national conversation to show this partnership and to show our communities how we can talk about the Middle East in a constructive way, in a way that is accommodating and being true to our principles, to say we're both, we both, we have different, for example, we have both different views on BDS, but we both believe that it should not be criminalized in the United States. So even if we have 5% commonality, how can we go from 5% to 10%? These are the difficult conversations I think we need to have. Then we can talk about if you want to support a Muslim organization, obviously MPAC should be number one on your list. You can support this voice because people keep asking, where's that moderate voice? Why aren't the Muslims speaking out? And we do speak out, we're just not heard. We don't have a PR, we're not a PR company. Where, as far as the scale of Muslim organizations, we're probably 10% of what Jewish organizations and Christian organizations and other religious organizations have. So we're still very young and very much early, very much on the early phases of our development. So supporting Muslim organizations by giving them a microphone so that the rest of the community can hear them, by sharing your information in your synagogue and your community, saying, oh, I just heard this from a Muslim organization, it's very interesting. Usually we hear the bad news, like al-Awlaki said this, and bin Laden said that, and ISIS, we don't hear the good. And as the Quran says, good and evil are not equal. Repel evil with that which is better and good, so that the one with whom there is enmity becomes as if he is your closest and warmest friend.
Well, Salam, I know I will take that to heart. I think we all at J Street take your words to heart, that we want to promote your voice and the voice of the Muslim community. To that end, we're actually going to be posting this webinar later today on demand, so you can share it with your friends and family at jstreet.org/j-stream. It'll be very easy if you just go to jstreet.org. It'll be easy to find. So thank you, Salam, again, for your time, for your commitment to pluralism and making our democracy better. And I wish you that you're a safe and healthy next few months as we ride out this crisis.
God willing, and God bless you for what you do, Hannah. And again, I'm very appreciative and in deep gratitude to the work with Jeremy and with J Street.
Great. Thanks all. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.